Sunday mornings in Hampstead had always been Sarah's sanctuary. The tree-lined streets held a peaceful silence that seemed almost sacred, broken only by the gentle jingle of Max's collar as they walked their familiar route. At 26, Sarah had built a comfortable routine around these quiet moments with her Belgian Malinois, a ritual that grounded her busy week as a marketing coordinator in central London. Max was everything she had hoped for when she adopted him 2 years ago. Intelligent, loyal, and beautifully trained, he moved with the confident grace that made Malinois such sought-after working dogs. His golden-brown coat caught the early morning light as they made their way down the quiet high street, past closed cafes and empty bus stops. Sarah treasured these hours before the world woke up, when London belonged to dog walkers and early joggers. She had stopped at the cash machine outside the old Barclays building, a routine task before their longer walk through the Heath. Max waited patiently beside her, his dark eyes scanning the street with the alertness that never quite left him, even in these peaceful moments. Sarah smiled as she tucked her cash into her small crossbody bag, feeling grateful for this simple, ordinary morning. It was then that she noticed them, 2 men, perhaps in their early 20s, walking with a purposefulness that didn't match the leisurely pace of a Sunday morning stroll. Something about their synchronized movement caught her attention, the way they seemed to be positioning themselves rather than simply walking. The first man, wearing a dark hoodie, had his hands deep in his jacket pockets. The second, slightly taller, walked a few steps ahead but kept glancing back. Sarah's heart began to beat faster, though she tried to convince herself she was being paranoid. Living in London had taught her to be aware of her surroundings, but she had never experienced anything truly frightening. She was, after all, walking with Max, whose imposing presence usually made people cross to the other side of the street. Max had wandered toward a nearby bin, sniffing with interest at something that had caught his attention. It was just for a moment, but in that brief instant when her protector was distracted, everything changed. The first man approached quickly, his hand shooting out to grab her arm with surprising force. "Give me your bag," he said, his voice low but urgent. "Don't make this difficult." Sarah's world seemed to slow down and speed up simultaneously. She could feel her pulse in her ears, could smell the cigarettes on his breath, could see the nervous energy in his eyes. The second man had moved behind her, and she felt something press against her back through her jacket. "Please," she managed to whisper, her voice barely audible. "I'll give you whatever you want." But before she could move, before she could even fully process what was happening, she heard a sound that sent relief flooding through her veins. Max's growl, deep and authoritative, seemed to come from somewhere primal and dangerous. The dog had turned from the bin and assessed the situation with lightning speed. His training, his instincts, everything that made him extraordinary kicked in at once. He didn't bark or make a show of aggression. Instead, he moved with the fluid precision of his working dog heritage, positioning himself between Sarah and the men with a grace that was both beautiful and terrifying. The first man's grip on Sarah's arm loosened as Max fixed him with a stare that promised consequences. The dog's body language shifted into something Sarah had never seen before, every muscle coiled and ready. His usually warm brown eyes now focused with laser intensity. "Call off your dog," the second man said, his voice higher now, nervous. Sarah found her voice stronger than before. "Max, stay," she commanded, surprised by her own authority. The men seemed to realize that their easy target had just become significantly more complicated. The Sunday morning street that had seemed so perfectly isolated now felt exposed, dangerous for them rather than for her. A car could turn the corner at any moment. A jogger might appear, and Max, beautiful Max, stood ready to defend her with every ounce of his 70-pound frame. The first man released her arm completely. "This isn't worth it," he muttered to his companion. "Smart choice," Sarah said, her confidence growing with each word. Max remained perfectly still, watching, waiting. The men backed away slowly, then turned and walked quickly down the street, glancing back only once before disappearing around the corner. Sarah stood there for several minutes, her legs shaking, her hands trembling as she reached down to touch Max's head. "Good boy," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Such a good boy." But as the immediate danger passed, something else began to settle over her, a cold realization of how vulnerable she had been, how differently this morning could have ended. The cash machine's security camera stared down at her like an unblinking eye, and she wondered if it had captured everything. If anyone would ever see how close she had come to something terrible. Max pressed against her leg, sensing her distress. His transformation back to gentle companion was as swift as his earlier change to protector, but Sarah found herself looking at him differently now. This beautiful, loving animal had depths she had never fully understood. He had been prepared to fight for her, to risk himself for her safety. As they walked home, Sarah's mind raced through what had happened. She replayed every moment, every word, every sensation. The weight of the second man's presence behind her. The smell of fear, both hers and theirs. The way Max had moved with such purpose, such professional clarity. Her flat in Belsize Park, usually a haven of comfort and familiarity, felt different when she unlocked the door. She moved through the rooms slowly, checking locks she had never questioned before, noting windows that had always seemed perfectly secure, but now felt vulnerable. Max followed her, his presence both reassuring and a constant reminder of what had almost happened. Sarah made tea with shaking hands, staring out her kitchen window at the quiet street below. Other people were beginning their Sunday routines, unaware that their neighbor had just experienced something that would change her forever. She could see dog walkers and families, people living in the same peaceful bubble she had inhabited just hours before. But she couldn't go back to that bubble. Wouldn't go back. As she sat at her kitchen table with Max lying at her feet, Sarah felt something crystallizing inside her. Fear, yes, but also determination. Anger at her own helplessness, but also gratitude for Max's protection. She had been lucky today, incredibly lucky, but luck wasn't something she wanted to depend on again. She pulled out her laptop and began searching. Self-defense classes in North London, advanced dog training programs, security systems for flats, personal safety courses. The list grew longer as her resolve strengthened. Max lifted his head, watching her with those intelligent eyes that seemed to understand more than any animal should. Sarah reached down to stroke his head, feeling the powerful muscles beneath his soft coat, the alertness that never fully relaxed. "We're going to learn," she told him quietly. "We're going to be ready." Outside her window, London continued its lazy Sunday rhythm, but inside the flat, something fundamental had shifted. Sarah Morrison, who had started the morning as just another young professional walking her dog, was already becoming someone else entirely, someone who would never again be caught unprepared. The transformation had begun with a few terrifying minutes on a quiet street. Where it would lead, she couldn't yet imagine. But as she sat planning and researching, with her loyal protector at her side, Sarah knew with absolute certainty that she would never be the same vulnerable woman she had been that morning. And perhaps, she thought as Max's steady breathing filled the quiet room, that was exactly what needed to happen. 3 months had passed since that Sunday morning, and Sarah's life had become unrecognizable even to herself. Her small flat in Belsize Park had transformed into something resembling a training facility. Dog agility equipment occupied her living room. Self-defense manuals lined her bookshelves, and her calendar was packed with classes, workshops, and training sessions that would have exhausted her former self. But Sarah Morrison was no longer her former self. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening found her at North London Martial Arts Academy, where instructor David Chen had become both teacher and therapist. At first her movements had been tentative, uncertain. She would flinch at sudden movements, apologize for taking up space, defer to other students who seemed more confident. But David had seen something in her, a determination that burned beneath the surface anxiety. "Confidence isn't the absence of fear," he had told her during their first private session. "It's knowing you can handle whatever comes your way." Now, as Sarah moved through her forms, her body had found a fluidity she never knew it possessed. Her kicks were precise, her blocks instinctive, and most importantly, she no longer apologized for the space she occupied. The nervous energy that had plagued her for weeks after the incident had been channeled into something powerful and purposeful. Max had his own training journey. 3 times a week, they traveled to Kent to work with Elena Rodriguez, a former police dog handler who understood the unique bond between working dogs and their handlers. Elena had recognized immediately that Max possessed exceptional natural ability. But she also saw that Sarah needed to learn to trust that ability completely. "Your dog already knows how to protect you, Eleanor had explained during their first session. Watching Max demonstrate perfect recall, controlled aggression, and protective positioning. What you need to learn is how to communicate with him as a team. The training was intense and often emotionally challenging. Sarah learned to read Max's subtle body language, to understand the difference between alert awareness and active concern. She practiced commands in German, the language most police and protection dogs were trained in, finding strength in the authoritative sound of her own voice calling out Platz and Bleib. But it was more than just the physical training that was transforming Sarah. Each session, each small victory, each moment when she felt truly in control, was rebuilding something fundamental that had been shaken that Sunday morning. She was reclaiming not just her sense of safety, but her sense of self. Her job at the marketing firm began to reflect these changes too. Colleagues noticed that Sarah spoke up more in meetings, took on more challenging projects, and carried herself with a new kind of confidence. Her manager, Rebecca, pulled her aside one afternoon. "I don't know what's changed," Rebecca said, "but whatever you're doing, keep doing it. You're becoming the professional I always suspected you could be." Sarah smiled, thinking of the hours she spent each morning before work, practicing forms in her living room while Max watched approvingly. "Yeah, I'm just finding my voice," she replied. The weekends had become sacred time for Sarah and Max. They would drive out to Hampstead Heath or Richmond Park, practicing recall exercises and protection work in open spaces. Other dog owners would watch with fascination as Max demonstrated his abilities, and Sarah found herself becoming something of a local expert on canine behavior and personal safety. It was during one of these weekend sessions that Sarah met Jennifer Walsh, a woman about her own age who had been watching their training with obvious interest. "I've been coming here for weeks, hoping to see you again," Jennifer confessed. "I heard about what happened to you and I wanted to ask, do you think you could teach me some of what you've learned?" Sarah felt a flutter of recognition in Jennifer's nervous energy, the way she glanced over her shoulder, the careful way she positioned herself with clear exits in view. Another woman who had learned that the world wasn't as safe as she had once believed. "Of course," Sarah said immediately. "Would you like to start today?" That afternoon marked the beginning of something Sarah hadn't expected. As she taught Jennifer basic awareness techniques and introduced her to Max, she realized she had found a calling she never knew existed. Teaching others gave her training new meaning, transformed her personal journey into something larger than herself. Word spread quietly through networks of women who understood the need for such knowledge. Sarah's flat became a meeting place on Sunday afternoons, where she would share what she had learned about personal safety, situational awareness, and building confidence. Max, ever the professional, became the perfect teaching assistant, demonstrating protective behaviors while remaining gentle and approachable with nervous newcomers. Elena noticed the change in both Sarah and Max during their professional sessions. "You two have found your purpose," she observed one afternoon as they worked on advanced scenario training. "Max was born to be a protection dog, but you were born to be his partner. More than that, you're both teachers now." The transformation wasn't just physical or professional, it was deeply emotional. Sarah found herself sleeping better, laughing more easily, and approaching each day with anticipation rather than anxiety. The hypervigilance that had plagued her immediately after the incident had evolved into healthy awareness, a confidence in her ability to assess and handle situations. Her relationship with her family improved dramatically as well. Her parents, who had been worried sick about their daughter living alone in London, now marveled at the poised, confident woman she had become. Her sister Emma, visiting for the weekend, watched in amazement as Sarah demonstrated some basic self-defense techniques. "You're like a completely different person," Emma said, not without admiration. "I mean that in the best way possible." Sarah considered this as they sat in her kitchen, Max resting peacefully at her feet. "I think I'm more myself than I've ever been," she replied. "It's like that morning showed me who I really was underneath all the politeness and people-pleasing." The legal proceedings from the incident had concluded months ago. The two men had been sentenced to community service and short jail terms, which had seemed frustratingly light to Sarah at the time. But now, as she reflected on how much her life had changed, she realized she was grateful the focus had shifted from punishment to her own empowerment. David at the Martial Arts Academy often used Sarah as an example for newer students. though always with her permission. Sarah came to us after a traumatic experience, he would explain. She could have let that experience define her as a victim. Instead, she used it as a catalyst to become stronger than she ever imagined possible. The Sunday afternoon group had grown to include 8 regular members, women of different ages and backgrounds, who had all found their way to Sarah's living room through various circumstances. There was Maria, a nurse who worked night shifts and felt vulnerable walking to her car. Susan, recently divorced and living alone for the first time in 20 years. Kate, a university student whose confidence had been shaken by an unsettling experience on campus. Each of them found something different in the training, but they all found Sarah's story inspiring. Here was someone who had faced their worst fear and emerged not just surviving, but thriving. The most important thing I learned, Sarah told the group during one session, is that strength isn't about never being afraid. It's about being afraid and choosing to act anyway. As spring turned to summer, Sarah's reputation in the community continued to grow. Local community centers began inviting her to speak about personal safety. The police liaison officer for their area asked if she would consider joining a community safety committee. Even Elena began referring other students to Sarah for basic awareness training. Max, now 4 years old, had reached the peak of his abilities. His bond with Sarah had deepened beyond what either of them could have imagined that first Sunday morning. They moved together with the synchronized precision of a dance partnership, each understanding the other's thoughts and intentions almost before they were formed. But it wasn't just their working relationship that had evolved. In quiet moments, Sarah would catch Max watching her with what she could only describe as pride. He had not only protected her that morning, he had been her partner in the transformation that followed. Every small victory, every moment of confidence, every successful training session had been shared between them. One evening, as they returned from a particularly successful group session at the Heath, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them here. The woman who had trembled at her kitchen table 9 months ago, researching self-defense classes with shaking fingers, felt like someone from another lifetime. Her phone rang as they reached their front door. It was Elena, and something in her voice immediately caught Sarah's attention. "Sarah, I need to tell you something," Elena said carefully. "I just received some information that I think you should know about. Can you come in tomorrow? We need to talk." A small chill ran down Sarah's spine, but it was different from the paralyzing fear she once would have felt. Now it was alertness, readiness, the controlled tension of someone prepared for whatever might come. "Of course," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "Is everything all right? Just come in tomorrow. And Sarah, bring Max. I think you're both going to need to be ready for what comes next." As Sarah hung up the phone, she looked down at Max, who was watching her with those intelligent eyes that seemed to understand everything. Whatever Elena needed to tell them, whatever new challenge lay ahead, she knew they would face it together. The woman who had been helpless that Sunday morning was gone forever. In her place stood someone who was ready for anything. The news that Elena delivered the next morning landed like a physical blow, despite all of Sarah's training and preparation. She sat in the familiar training facility, Max alert at her side, listening to words that brought her carefully rebuilt world into sharp, uncomfortable focus. "Marcus Webb was released from prison 3 days ago," Elena said gently, watching Sarah's face for any sign of the panic that might have consumed her a year ago. "Early release for good behavior. I have contacts in the system who thought you should know." Sarah felt her breath catch, but not in the desperate, drowning way she once might have. Instead, she felt her training kick in, her mind immediately shifting into assessment mode. Marcus Webb. She had tried to put that name out of her memory, but it had always lingered there, attached to that Sunday morning that changed everything. 3 days, Sarah repeated, her voice steady, despite the gravity of what she was processing. "Has there been any indication that he might try to contact me or find me?" Elena shook her head. "Nothing official. But Sarah, you need to understand that men, like Marcus, don't always let things go. The fact that he couldn't complete what he started, that he was arrested because of you and Max, these types sometimes carry grudges." Max seemed to sense the shift in energy in the room. He moved closer to Sarah, not in panic but in readiness. The months of training had taught him to read her emotional state with precision, and he was responding to her heightened alertness with his own professional focus. "What do you think I should do?" Sarah asked, surprised by how calm she sounded. "You do exactly what you've been doing," Elena replied firmly. "You stay aware, you trust your instincts, and you remember that you're not the same woman you were that morning. Neither is Max. If Marcus Webb is foolish enough to come anywhere near you, he's going to discover that he's making a very serious mistake." Over the following weeks, Sarah found herself tested in ways she hadn't expected. It wasn't the overwhelming fear she had anticipated, but rather a heightened state of awareness that felt both exhausting and strangely energizing. Every unfamiliar car on her street received scrutiny. Every unexpected sound at night brought her to full alertness. But instead of cowering, she found herself checking her security systems, reviewing her emergency protocols, and feeling grateful for every hour of training that had prepared her for this possibility. The first sign that her vigilance was justified came on a Thursday evening. Sarah arrived home from work to find her building's entrance door propped open, something the residents were always careful about. The security camera in the lobby had been spray-painted black, a vandalism that seemed both random and targeted. Her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson from the ground floor, was in the lobby looking distressed. "Oh, Sarah dear, I'm so glad you're here. Someone's been tampering with the mailboxes, and I found this on the floor." She handed Sarah a crumpled piece of paper with her flat number written on it in block letters. Nothing else, just the number, but it felt heavy with implication. That night, Sarah called Elena and then David from the Martial Arts Academy. Both agreed that she should report it to the police, but also acknowledged that there wasn't much they could do with such circumstantial evidence. "The important thing is that you're aware something's happening," David told her over the phone. "Trust your instincts and don't second-guess your security measures." Sarah spent the evening reviewing her protocols, testing her alarm system, and running through scenarios with Max. The dog seemed to understand that they were moving into a different phase of their partnership. His alertness had sharpened, his protective instincts heightened, without losing any of his disciplined control. The Sunday afternoon group noticed the change in Sarah's energy when they met that weekend. She was still the confident teacher they had come to rely on. But there was an edge to her awareness that hadn't been there before. Jennifer, who had become something of a co-facilitator for the group, pulled Sarah aside after the session. "Is everything all right? You seem different today." Sarah considered how much to share. These women looked to her for strength and guidance, but she also believed in being honest about the realities they all faced. "Someone from my past might be trying to re-establish contact," she said carefully. "It's reminded me that the work we do here isn't just theoretical. We have to stay sharp, stay ready." The group received this information with the seriousness it deserved. Rather than being frightened, they seemed to draw strength from Sarah's example of how to handle a real threat with preparation and composure. Over the next 2 weeks, the signs became more frequent and more personal. Her car's wing mirror was found adjusted when she was certain she had left it in a different position. A coffee cup appeared on the wall outside her building's entrance, positioned where it would be visible from her window. Most unsettling, her usual jogging route through Hampstead Heath showed signs of disturbance. Branches broken at eye level, footprints in mud that seemed to follow her regular path. Each incident was reported to the police, building a file that might eventually be useful, but offered little immediate protection. Detective Inspector Clark, who had handled the original case, was sympathetic but honest about the limitations they faced. "We're taking this seriously, Sarah," she assured her during a meeting at the station, "but until he makes direct contact or commits an actual offense, our hands are tied. The good news is that you're not the vulnerable woman you were when this started. You've prepared for this possibility better than anyone could have expected." Sarah found strength in the detective's words, but she also realized that she was essentially on her own. The system that had failed to prevent Marcus Webb's early release was also limited in its ability to protect her from his psychological games. It was Max who provided the clearest indication that their vigilance was justified. They were returning from their evening walk when he suddenly stopped, every line of his body radiating alertness. Sarah immediately scanned their surroundings, seeing nothing unusual, but trusting Max's superior senses completely. "What is it, boy?" she asked quietly, following his gaze toward a parked van across the street. The van itself looked ordinary, but something about it was wrong. It was parked in a spot that offered a clear view of her building's entrance, and though she couldn't see inside the tinted windows, she felt the weight of observation. Sarah didn't hesitate. She pulled out her phone and photographed the van, including its license plate, then called Elena while walking Max in the opposite direction. "Trust your instincts," Elena said immediately. "If Max is alerting and you feel watched, then you are being watched." "What do you want to do?" Sarah felt a moment of pride in her answer. "I want to take control of the situation." They developed a plan that night. Sarah would vary her routines unpredictably, use different exits from her building, and enlist the help of her Sunday group to provide additional eyes and awareness. Most importantly, she would stop being reactive and start being proactive. The next morning, Sarah did something that would have terrified her old self. She approached the van. With Max at her side and her phone ready to call for help, she walked directly across the street and knocked on the driver's window. The engine started immediately, and the van pulled away quickly, but not before she got a clear look at the driver. Marcus Webb had changed in his months in prison. His face was thinner, harder, marked by an anger that seemed to radiate from his eyes even through the brief glimpse she caught. But Sarah felt no fear looking at him. Instead, she felt a cold, steady determination. He was not the powerful figure who had terrorized her that Sunday morning. He was a small man making small, cowardly gestures from the shadows, and she was no longer the woman who could be terrorized. That evening, Sarah called a special meeting of her Sunday group. 8 women gathered in her living room along with Max, and she told them everything. "This is what we've been training for," she said simply. "Not just for the moment when someone grabs you on the street, but for the longer campaign, the psychological warfare, the attempt to make you feel unsafe in your own life." The women listened intently as Sarah outlined her plan. They would create a network, checking in with each other regularly, providing backup for activities that felt risky, and maintaining collective awareness of anyone who might be watching or following. "We're not going to let one man's anger define how we live our lives," Sarah declared. "We're going to show him what it looks like when women refuse to be victims." Maria, the night shift nurse, was the first to speak up. "I'm in. What do you need me to do?" One by one, the others voiced their commitment. Kate, the university student, offered to coordinate communication through a secure group chat. Susan, the recently divorced woman, volunteered to research legal options for restraining orders. Jennifer offered to liaise with Elena about additional security training. As the meeting concluded and the women prepared to leave, Sarah felt something she hadn't expected. Not just confidence or determination, but joy. These women, brought together by various experiences with vulnerability, had become something powerful. They were no longer isolated individuals dealing with their fears alone. They were a community, a support system, a force. Max, who had observed the entire meeting with his usual professional attention, seemed to understand that something significant had shifted. As the last woman left, he moved to his position by the window, not with anxiety, but with the calm readiness of a protector who knew he was no longer protecting just one person, but an entire network of people who had learned to protect themselves. Sarah stood beside him, looking out at the quiet street where Marcus Webb might be watching, might be planning, might be thinking he could intimidate her back into the frightened woman she once was. "Let him come," she said quietly to Max, who looked up at her with complete understanding. "We're ready." Outside, London continued its evening rhythm, unaware that in one small flat in Belsize Park, a woman and her dog were preparing for whatever shadows might emerge from the past. But this time, they would not be facing those shadows alone, and they would not be facing them unprepared. The game had changed, and Marcus Webb was about to discover just how much. The confrontation came on, a Tuesday evening, exactly 18 months after that first Sunday morning that had changed everything. Sarah was returning from her advanced training session with Elena when she found Marcus Webb waiting outside her building, no longer hiding in vans or lurking in shadows, but standing boldly in the lamplight as if he owned the space. For a moment that stretched like an eternity. They faced each other across the familiar street where she had walked Max hundreds of times since that first traumatic encounter. But this time everything was different. This time Sarah felt no fear. Max, walking calmly beside her, immediately assessed the situation with professional precision. His body language shifted subtly into alert mode, but he showed no signs of panic or aggression. He was simply ready, waiting for Sarah's command, trusting completely in their partnership. "Hello, Sarah," Marcus said, his voice carrying an edge of menace that would have terrified her old self. "I think we need to talk." Sarah felt her training engage like a switch being flipped. Every lesson, every hour of preparation, every moment of building confidence crystallized into calm, steady readiness. She stopped walking, maintaining optimal distance between them, keeping Max positioned strategically at her side. "No, we don't," she replied, her voice carrying an authority that surprised even her. "You need to leave, now." Marcus stepped closer, and Sarah saw something flicker in his eyes that she recognized from that Sunday morning. The same predatory calculation that had once frozen her with terror. But now she read it differently. Now she saw desperation masked as aggression, weakness disguised as strength. "You cost me 2 years of my life," he said, his voice rising slightly. 2 years in that place, and for what? A handbag and some cash? You should have just given me what I wanted." "What you wanted," Sarah repeated, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flowing through her system, "was to hurt someone who couldn't defend herself. That person doesn't exist anymore." As if to punctuate her words, Max moved slightly forward, not aggressively, but with the fluid confidence of a professional who knew exactly what he was capable of. The movement was subtle, but its message was clear. Marcus glanced at the dog, and Sarah saw recognition in his eyes. He remembered Max, remembered what had happened the last time he had underestimated the partnership between them. "You think your dog makes you safe?" Marcus asked, but there was less certainty in his voice now. "I think my training makes me safe," Sarah corrected. "I think my awareness makes me safe. I think the community of people who know where I am and when to expect me home makes me safe. Max is just one element of a life I've built to ensure that what happened that morning never happens again." As she spoke, Sarah became aware of movement around them. Jennifer was approaching from the north end of the street, walking her own dog as they had planned. Maria was visible in her car at the corner, positioned to call for help if needed. The network they had built was activating, not out of fear, but out of collective strength. Marcus noticed the other women too, and for the first time since he had appeared, uncertainty crossed his features. This was not the isolated, vulnerable target he had expected to find. "This isn't over," he said, but the words lacked conviction. "Yes, it is," Sarah replied with quiet finality. "It was over the moment you decided to target someone who refused to stay a victim. You've spent 18 months trying to reclaim some sense of power over me, but you never had power over me, Marcus. That morning, you tried to take something from someone who was stronger than you realized. Tonight, you're discovering just how much stronger I've become." Detective Inspector Clark emerged from a police car that had been waiting around the corner, along with another officer. Sarah's network had included official channels as well as personal ones. "Marcus Webb," D.I. Clark said calmly, "I'm going to need you to come with us. We've had reports of harassment, stalking, and violation of the terms of your release." For a moment, Marcus looked as if he might resist, might try to escalate the situation. But as he looked around at the women positioned throughout the area, at Max standing ready, at the police officers approaching professionally, he seemed to understand that he was outnumbered in every way that mattered. As the police led Marcus away, he looked back at Sarah one final time. What she saw in his eyes wasn't anger anymore, but something that looked almost like confusion. He had expected to find his victim waiting for him, paralyzed by fear and memories. Instead, he had found a woman who had transformed her trauma into strength, her vulnerability into power. The next few hours passed in a blur of police statements, paperwork and phone calls to her support network. By midnight, Sarah was finally alone in her flat with Max, processing what had happened. She realized that she felt no triumph, no sense of victory over Marcus Webb. Instead, she felt something more profound, completion. The circle that had begun that Sunday morning was finally closed, not through revenge or retaliation, but through the simple act of refusing to be diminished by someone else's attempt to diminish her. Max seemed to understand that their vigil was over. He settled beside her on the sofa, with a deep sigh that seemed to release months of protective tension. They had done what they needed to do. They had kept each other safe. The weeks that followed brought unexpected developments. Marcus Webb was charged with multiple violations and would be returning to prison for a substantial sentence. But more importantly for Sarah, the incident had crystallized something important about the work she had been doing. Eleanor approached her with a proposition that would have seemed impossible 18 months earlier. "I want you to become a certified trainer," she said during one of their sessions. "You have something special, Sarah. You understand both sides of this, the vulnerability and the strength. You could help so many people." The Sunday afternoon group had evolved as well. What had started as informal gatherings in Sarah's living room had grown into something more structured and far-reaching. Community centers were asking them to present workshops. The police liaison office wanted to incorporate their approach into official safety programs. Other cities were inquiring about replicating their model. Sarah found herself standing before audiences, telling her story not as a victim who had survived, but as someone who had discovered strength she never knew she possessed. Max, now 5 years old and at the peak of his abilities, had become something of a celebrity in the working dog community, an example of the incredible bond possible between human and canine partners. But it was in the quiet moments that Sarah felt the deepest satisfaction. When Jennifer successfully defended herself against an aggressive ex-boyfriend using techniques they had practiced together. When Maria confidently walked to her car after night shifts without the crippling anxiety that had once plagued her. When Kate graduated university and moved to a new city, carrying with her the self-assurance they had helped her build. One evening, almost exactly 2 years after that first Sunday morning, Sarah was walking Max through Hampstead Heath when they encountered a young woman who seemed distressed. She was crying softly, looking around nervously, clearly shaken by something. Without hesitation, Sarah approached her. "Are you all right? Can I help?" The woman, probably in her early 20s, looked up with eyes that Sarah recognized immediately. The same combination of fear, anger, and confusion that she had once seen in her own mirror. "I was just mugged," the young woman said shakily. 3 men near the car park. They took my purse, my phone. I managed to get away, but I don't know what to do." Sarah felt something shift inside her, a sense of purpose so clear it was almost physical. She sat down beside the young woman, Max positioning himself protectively nearby, and began to talk. She talked about fear and strength, about vulnerability and power, about the choice between being defined by trauma or using it as a catalyst for transformation. She talked about the community of women who had found their voices, about the training that had given them confidence, about the dogs who had become their partners in building new lives. As they talked, Sarah realized that this moment was what everything had been leading to. Not the confrontation with Marcus Webb, not the media attention or professional recognition, but this quiet conversation with a frightened woman who needed to know that she wasn't alone, that she wasn't powerless, that she could choose to become something stronger than her worst experience. By the time they parted, the young woman had Sarah's phone number, information about the training programs, and most importantly, hope. She had met someone who understood exactly what she was feeling, and who had proof that those feelings didn't have to define her forever. Walking home with Max under the London streetlights, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The woman who had trembled at her kitchen table, researching self-defense classes with shaking hands, felt like a character from a story rather than her former self. She had learned that strength wasn't about never being afraid, but about being afraid and choosing to act anyway. She had discovered that vulnerability wasn't weakness when it was transformed into empathy and used to help others. Most importantly, she had understood that the most powerful response to someone trying to make you feel small was to become larger than they ever imagined possible. Max looked up at her as they reached their front door, his intelligent eyes reflecting the streetlight. In those eyes, Sarah saw recognition of their shared journey, pride in what they had accomplished together, and readiness for whatever challenges might come next. "Good boy," she whispered. The same words she had spoken that first morning, but now they carried the weight of everything they had overcome together. Inside their flat, now filled with certificates, training equipment, and photos from workshops and seminars, Sarah made her evening tea and settled at her kitchen table with Max at her feet. Her laptop was open to emails from women around the country asking for guidance, from training facilities requesting partnerships, from community organizations seeking speakers. Each message represented someone who had decided to transform their fear into strength, their vulnerability into power. Each represented a small victory against the forces that tried to make people feel helpless and alone. As Sarah began to respond to the messages, planning workshops and coordinating with other trainers, she felt Max's steady breathing beside her and knew that they had found their true calling. They were no longer just survivors of a traumatic morning. They had become guides for others walking the same path from victimhood to empowerment. The circle was not just closed, but opening again, creating new possibilities for healing and strength that rippled outward like waves from a stone dropped in still water. Outside, London slept